Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
Have you ever had someone hurt you so many times that when they finally act kind, it just feels like another trap? What would you have done in my place? Would you have sipped the coffee or poured it down the drain? I don't remember what started the fight, not exactly. Maybe it was Leah rolling her eyes at something my father said about kids these days. Or maybe it was me, tired and short-tempered, snapping back at him for always needing to be right. That kind of heat doesn't come from one match. It builds from years of dry grass, brittle memories, and unspoken resentments. The air in the kitchen that morning was heavy with all of it. Things we hadn't said, things we weren't allowed to say, and things we couldn't ever take back. Dad had said something cruel. I think it was about Susan, my sister, and I had shot back with something even worse. Leah had stormed off upstairs, and then the house went dead quiet. He didn't say a word for a full 20 minutes, just sat at the table staring out the window like he was watching a war zone instead of a patchy backyard with a rusted-out barbecue and a dying lilac bush. I busied myself with dishes I didn't need to clean, hands moving on autopilot, heart pounding because the silence was worse than the yelling. He used to raise his voice, loud, commanding, booming. But now he just said less and less, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any screaming match we ever had. I could hear the ticking of the old kitchen clock. I could hear Leah's bedroom door creak as she closed it gently, like she didn't want to be heard, like she was trying to disappear. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked to the coffee pot. The smell hit me before the sound of it pouring. He didn't ask if I wanted any, just filled a chipped mug, white with a faded number 1 dad on the side, a lie if I'd ever seen one, and set it in front of me. Then he sat back down, folded his hands on the table, and said quietly, "Let's just move on." It was that casual, that clean, like years of damage could be washed away with caffeine and a half-hearted olive branch. I looked down at the coffee, then back at him. His face was stone, no apology, no warmth, just that familiar mask of authority and distance that he'd worn since I was old enough to recognize disappointment. I lifted the mug, not because I was ready to forgive, but because I wanted to see if he'd flinch. I took a slow sip, feeling the bitter heat slide down my throat. Then I set it down, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "You first." At first, he didn't react. He blinked once, maybe twice. His jaw moved slightly, like he was trying to process whether I was calling his bluff or daring him to drink. For a moment, I wondered if he was afraid I'd poisoned it. But then I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, not guilt, something closer to realization. He reached for the mug I'd just set down, lifted it to his lips, and took a long swallow. He held my gaze the entire time, as if trying to prove a point. Like we were still in one of those silent contests we used to have when I was a kid. Who could go longer without looking away? Who could win a fight without raising their voice? But after that second sip, something shifted. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. His hands, which had been perfectly still on the table, began to tremble slightly. Not a lot, just enough to make the edge of the mug tap against the saucer. He set it down carefully, but his fingers didn't stop shaking. I didn't say anything, but my heart picked up speed, pounding against my ribs like it was trying to get out. He coughed once, then looked down at his hands. "Blood sugar's low," he muttered, though he hadn't touched breakfast. I didn't respond, I just watched. Watched the way his fingers flexed and stiffened. Watched the way he refused to meet my eyes again. It wasn't the coffee. It couldn't have been. I'd taken the first sip. He drank from the same mug, but something was off. Something in the way he swallowed, like it hurt, like he wasn't expecting the burn. And then his eyes flicked toward the hallway, just for a second, just a quick glance, barely a movement, but I saw it. He looked toward Leah's room. My blood ran cold. The fight we had earlier hadn't even been about her, not directly, but she'd been quiet lately, asking questions about old photo albums, noticing things I thought I'd hidden well. She's sharp like that, too sharp. And I'd seen the way he watched her. Not in a bad way, not creepy, but familiar. Like he was measuring her against some invisible standard. Like he was waiting to see something in her that he'd lost in me, and in Susan before that. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, slower. "She's just a kid, Rachel. Don't pull her into all this." I stared at him for a long time. "You already did," I said. He flinched. Not much. Just a flicker behind the eyes again. But I saw it. I always saw it. I saw the tremor that had nothing to do with blood sugar. I saw the guilt he'd never speak out loud. I saw the lie he was still holding on to with both hands, even as they shook in front of me. And in that moment, I knew the coffee wasn't about peace. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about control. It always had been. He wanted to end the conversation before it started. Wanted to serve me something warm, something familiar, and pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. It had never been fine. And now I was starting to remember things I hadn't let myself think about in decades. Things Susan used to say. Things we were told to forget. Things buried deep in boxes under the stairs and behind padlocks in the back shed. Things I wasn't supposed to know. He stood up slowly, muttering something about needing to lie down. I didn't stop him. I just watched him walk away. Hands still shaking, shoulders heavier than I'd ever seen them. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. I didn't know exactly what was wrong yet, but I knew one thing. I was going to find out. And when I did, he'd be the one begging to move on. Not me. The next morning began the way so many mornings had in that house. Quiet, stiff, and full of pretense, like the walls themselves were trying to pretend they hadn't heard the night before, as if the wallpaper and old ceiling fan and floorboards could keep secrets better than the people living inside. My father had already made his breakfast by the time I came down. 2 eggs, overcooked, a slice of dry toast, and black coffee, because heaven forbid he admit the acid had been eating at his gut for years. He didn't look at me when I walked in. Didn't say anything. Just kept chewing in that slow, deliberate way he did when he was pretending he was in control. I didn't ask how he was feeling. I didn't mention the shaking hands or the way he practically stumbled getting out of his chair the night before. We just went on, like always, playing house on top of a pile of rot no one wanted to name. Leah came downstairs wearing one of my old college hoodies, the sleeves too long for her arms, her face still puffy from sleep, and sat across from me without a word. She didn't glance at her grandfather, which meant she was still angry about the fight. Or worse, she wasn't angry at all, just resigned. That scared me more than anything. I'd lived most of my adult life trying to unlearn resignation, and watching her slide into it, watching her build the same armor I'd spent years trying to crack open, made something cold settle in my stomach. I tried to act normal, tried to talk about school, her weekend plans, anything to bring her back to herself. But she just picked at a piece of toast and said, almost absently, "Why don't we have any pictures of Uncle Eli?" It was so casual that it took me a second to register what she'd said. And in that second, the entire room seemed to shift. My father froze, only for a moment, but it was enough. His fork paused just above the plate, his jaw locked in place, and I could see the years slam down on his shoulders like a trapdoor opening under his feet. He didn't answer, didn't move, just kept staring straight ahead, like if he didn't look at us, maybe the question hadn't really been asked. I forced a smile, too wide and too brittle, and said something stupid about how Eli died when I was little, and there weren't many photos, and Mom didn't like to keep things out that reminded her of sad times. But even as I said it, I felt the lie twist in my throat like a splinter, because it wasn't true. There were pictures once. I remember seeing them. A little boy with bright eyes and a bowl cut. Always in overalls, always with dirt on his face like he'd never stopped playing outside. I remembered them because one day, they were just gone. Every single one, like he'd been erased on purpose. Leah shrugged, unconvinced, and went back to picking at her toast, but I watched my father, who stood up suddenly, scraped his plate into the trash, and left the room without a word. The back door creaked a few seconds later. I knew where he was going. He always went there when things got too close. The shed behind the garage, the one he kept padlocked like it held state secrets instead of old tools and broken lawn chairs. When I was a kid, it was the one place we weren't allowed to go, no matter what. Even when we were bored and sneaky and desperate for places to hide, even when Susan dared me to pick the lock or said she heard noises coming from it at night, I never opened that door, not once. But that morning, something snapped. I waited until I heard the rattle of the lock and the rustle of boxes being moved around. And then I walked into the hallway and opened the hall closet, the one with the ancient board games and winter coats no one wore anymore, and pulled out the photo box, the one labeled Family 1980s, 1990s in my mother's handwriting, faded and smudged but unmistakable. I'd gone through it before, years ago, after the funeral, but I didn't remember looking too closely. I hadn't wanted to. Now I pulled out every single envelope, every album, every torn corner and yellowed Polaroid. There were pictures of Susan in a frilly dress at 6, me in my high school marching band uniform, Mom smiling in front of the Christmas tree, even a few of Dad in his younger days, holding a beer at a barbecue with that look of pride that always made my stomach tighten. But nothing of Eli, except one. Tucked between 2 receipts and a photo of our old dog was a single picture, badly cropped, bent in the corner. It was of Susan and me, probably 5 and 8 years old, sitting on the swing set out back. And between us, half shadowed, like he hadn't meant to be in the frame, was Eli. I recognized the overalls. I recognized the cowlick in his hair, but more than that, I recognized the expression. He wasn't smiling. He looked scared, not just shy or grumpy, but genuinely frightened, like someone had told him to smile and he didn't know how. His eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking past it, at someone, at something. I stared at that picture for a long time, long enough that I didn't hear the front door open until Leah called my name from the hallway. I shoved the photo in my back pocket and closed the box, heart thudding against my ribs like it was trying to warn me. Leah walked into the living room, holding something small in her hands. "Grandpa dropped this," she said, handing me an old key. It was tarnished, worn from use, small enough to fit in a child's palm. I turned it over once, twice, and something in me went very still, because I knew exactly what it opened. And I knew that if I used it, nothing in that house would ever feel safe again. That night, after Leah had gone to bed and the lights were off, I went out to the back deck, stood in the dark, and stared at the shed. I could still smell the motor oil and grass clippings from 30 years ago, like the memories had seeped into the wood. I thought about calling Susan. We hadn't spoken in 15 years, not since Mom's funeral, but my fingers were already dialing before I realized it. Muscle memory stronger than bitterness. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying, or maybe like she hadn't spoken in days. I said her name once, softly, and for a moment there was nothing but breathing. Then she said one sentence, so quiet I almost missed it. "You opened the box, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Because the thing about family secrets is, you don't need to say them out loud for them to be real. They live in the silence, and I had just cracked one open. When Susan said those 5 words, "You opened the box, didn't you?" there was something in her voice that didn't sound like surprise, and didn't quite sound like fear either, but rather a kind of tiredness that only comes from living for too long with something you're not allowed to say out loud, the kind of fatigue that soaks deep into your bones, like dampness in the foundation of an old house, impossible to dry out, no matter how many windows you open or how many lights you leave on at night. I didn't answer her question, not directly, because the truth sat thick in my throat, and even if I'd wanted to speak, I don't think the words would have come out right. So instead, I just breathed into the silence, waiting for her to fill it like she always used to do when we were kids, when I'd follow her around like a shadow, watching how she read people, how she read Dad, how she always knew what not to say when things got too quiet. "I told you he wouldn't stop," she said after a moment. And that's when the tremor started in my hands, not because I understood what she meant entirely, but because part of me did, somewhere deep down in a place I'd boarded up and marked as off limits years ago. Susan had always been better at facing the dark. I'd been the one to pretend it wasn't there. I asked her what happened, because I needed to hear her say it, needed to pull the truth out into the open, where I could finally see it, touch it, turn it over in my mind, and decide what to do with it. But Susan didn't answer the way I wanted her to. She never gave straight answers. She gave pieces. Shards of glass you had to handle carefully because they cut you whether you picked them up or not. "You ever wonder why I left?" she asked instead. And I could feel her watching me across the years and miles, even through the phone line, like she knew I was about to lie and say no, when of course I had wondered. Of course I'd counted every year, every birthday she missed, every holiday card she never sent. Every time Leah asked why she didn't have an Aunt Susan like her friends had aunts who showed up with presents and hugs and stories. And the truth was, I'd stopped asking myself why Susan left, not because I didn't care, but because I was scared I already knew the answer and just didn't want to face it. "She's just like him," Susan said. And at first I thought she was talking about herself, or maybe me, but then I realized she meant Leah. That same way of tilting her head when she's thinking, that same stillness when she's angry, like she's trying to hold everything in until she can weaponize it later. I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to defend my daughter, to say that Leah was nothing like Dad, that she was kind and sharp and emotional in ways he never allowed himself to be. But I knew what Susan meant. There were moments, fleeting, quiet moments, when I'd catch Leah watching me or watching her grandfather, and something about the calculation in her eyes made my skin crawl just a little, not because she was cruel, but because she understood too much too soon. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Dad saw it too, that he'd noticed it before I had, that maybe he was trying to mold her the way he once tried to mold us. Susan asked if I still had the key, and when I said yes, she let out a breath so heavy it cracked in the middle, like she'd been holding it for half her life. "Don't open it," she said, "not without knowing what you're looking for." And that was the problem. I didn't know. I didn't know what I was looking for, or what I was afraid I'd find. I just knew that ever since Leah mentioned Eli, something had shifted in the air around us. The past wasn't sleeping anymore. It was stretching, yawning, cracking its old knuckles, and creeping back into the corners of the house. The next morning, I found my father sitting on the back porch, staring out at the trees like they were whispering to him. His coffee sat untouched next to him, cold and forgotten. And in his lap was a notebook, one I hadn't seen in years, the kind he used to carry when Mom was sick, full of scribbled medication times and doctor's numbers and paranoid notes about who visited the house and when. I sat across from him, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me with those pale eyes, bleached out from age, and whatever secrets he'd buried in them, and said something I wasn't expecting. "She'll leave you one day," he said. "They always leave when they find out what kind of man you are." And I just stared at him, stunned into silence, because it wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Not with anger or accusation, but with something closer to certainty, like he'd been there before, like he knew the shape of that particular heartbreak and was now passing it down the line, father to daughter, like a family heirloom no one asked for. I told him Leah wasn't like that she loved me, that she was a good kid. He just nodded, slow and deliberate. Good kids don't stay good when they grow up in bad places. I didn't want to admit it, but the words sank in deep, like a stone dropped into muddy water, stirring up all the silt and buried things you tried to forget. That night, after everyone went to bed, I went into the bathroom and checked the medicine cabinet. Dad had a bottle of pills, gabapentin, something for nerve pain, but the label had been peeled off and retyped. And when I held it up to the light, I saw another name faintly behind the sticker. Leah's name. It was hers. It had been hers. From a prescription we got filled last year after a sports injury she had from falling off the balance beam. But Dad had kept it, repurposed it, hidden it in plain sight, and suddenly the shaking made sense. The coffee, the hands. It wasn't his body failing. It was a dosage mistake. Or maybe not a mistake at all. I stared at the bottle in my hand and felt the breath leave my lungs like someone had punched me. Because I didn't know what was worse, that he had stolen her meds to deal with his own pain, or that he had done it deliberately, knowing I might one day notice, knowing I might draw the wrong conclusions, just to see what I'd do. Because if there was one thing my father loved more than control, it was watching people squirm under the illusion of it. And I was done squirming. The next morning, I told Leah we were going to clean out the shed. She raised an eyebrow, asked if Grandpa was okay with that. I told her I didn't care, and she just nodded, like she already knew this day was coming. I didn't tell her about the key. I didn't tell her what I'd found. Because sometimes, silence isn't a lie. It's the only armor you have left. There's something unnatural about cleaning a space that was never meant to be clean. And even though I had scrubbed bathrooms after my mother's chemo sessions and emptied trash cans that had held more sorrow than garbage, nothing prepared me for the feeling I got when I stood in front of that shed with the key clenched tight in my fist, like it might burn through my skin if I didn't hold it just right. The lock clicked with a sound so soft it should have been forgettable, but it echoed through my chest like a warning bell, reverberating through every year I had spent pretending this place was nothing more than storage. Nothing more than cobwebs and rust and silence. Leah stood behind me, arms crossed, her weight shifting between feet like she wasn't sure if she was supposed to be a teenager, helping her mom with chores, or a witness to something sacred, something forbidden. I didn't say anything when I pulled the doors open, didn't offer her an explanation or a story or even a shrug, because the truth was I didn't have anything left in me that resembled reassurance. The moment the doors creaked apart, a wave of air hit us, musty, stale, but tinged with something sweeter, something that reminded me of motor oil mixed with old paper, the kind of scent that never really dies, only lingers like a ghost waiting to be noticed. The light inside was dim, filtered through a single grime-covered window, and I had to squint to make sense of the shapes stacked around the walls. Boxes labeled in my father's blocky handwriting, Xmas decor, tools, MIC, and others marked with nothing at all, which was already more suspicious than anything else. The first thing I noticed was that the place was far too clean for a space that hadn't supposedly been opened in years. No spiderwebs in the corners, no mouse droppings, no dust on the handles of the cabinets bolted to the back wall. It wasn't just that someone had been in here recently. It was that someone had been maintaining it, caring for it in secret, like a shrine. I moved slowly, touching nothing at first, just letting my eyes scan the space, absorbing every detail with a creeping sense of familiarity that made my stomach turn. There were objects that should not have existed anymore. An old tape recorder we used to play with as kids, still with a cracked cassette inside, a faded lunchbox from the early 90s, the kind with the cartoon dinosaurs on the side, and a child's sweater, small pale blue, and unmistakably Eli's. I knew it was his because I remembered the patches. One shaped like a train, another like a smiling sun, meticulously sewn on by our mother, who always said boys didn't need to look fancy, just loved. Leah found the first box of photographs, tucked in the corner under a folded tarp. She didn't ask if she could open it, she just did, her fingers moving faster than I'd ever seen them, like she was racing against something. Inside were photos I had never seen before. Photos of Eli by himself, in various places. On the porch, in the living room, sitting on Dad's lap, standing stiffly next to a Christmas tree that looked too tall and too new to have belonged to us. What struck me wasn't the fact that the photos existed after we'd been told they didn't. It was the way Eli looked in them. The same expression in every single frame, wide-eyed, almost dazed, like someone had told him to smile but hadn't given him a reason. In the bottom of the box, under the last stack of photos, was a folder, yellowed with age and labeled only with the letter E. I opened it, my hands shaking now, because somewhere deep in my gut, I knew this was going to hurt in a way that went deeper than memory. Inside were medical forms, pages from child services, and school disciplinary records. But what stood out, what knocked the air clean out of my lungs, was a letter, handwritten, dated just weeks before Eli fell down the stairs. The official story we'd all been fed. The one that never sat right with me, not even when I was too young to articulate why. The letter was from a counselor. It mentioned bruises. It mentioned missed appointments. It mentioned fear. And at the bottom, under a signature I didn't recognize, was a line that changed everything. Child has expressed desire to live with eldest sister, Susan, and reports discomfort with father's presence, requesting follow-up on possible emergency placement. I didn't realize I'd sat down on the floor until Leah knelt next to me, her eyes wide but unreadable. She didn't speak, just looked at me like she knew I needed a moment to reorient myself, to find some ground that wasn't rotting beneath my feet. I turned to the cabinet against the back wall, the one bolted shut with an extra chain across the handles. The key didn't work for that one, but a bolt cutter hanging beside it did. Inside, we found a collection of VHS tapes, labeled with dates and initials, none of which made sense to me at first. Some were marked EM, while others had just months and years. August 1994, March 1996. There was a small TV VCR combo plugged into the wall, and I knew the second I saw it that this had been a routine, a ritual. I picked one tape at random, August 1994, and shoved it into the machine with more anger than care. What came up on screen wasn't violent. It wasn't shocking in the way crime shows would have you expect. But it was wrong. Footage of Eli sitting at the kitchen table, clearly recorded without his knowledge, just eating cereal. Another shot of him in the backyard, swinging in silence, alone. Another of him sleeping. Hours of footage, mundane but obsessive, the kind that said someone had been watching him not out of love, but out of control. And I knew whose hands had held the camera. There was no doubt. I pulled the tape out before Leah could see more, before she asked questions I wasn't ready to answer, because even though there was no screaming, no sapping, no overt violence, the feeling of violation was thick in the air, like smoke. What kind of father records his child like that? What kind of man stores the evidence like a prize? We didn't finish cleaning. We didn't speak on the walk back to the house. That night, I cooked dinner like nothing had changed. Like I hadn't just walked through a mausoleum of secrets. Like I hadn't just opened a door that couldn't be closed again. My father didn't ask about the shed. He didn't even look at me, but I saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes stayed on Leah too long when she passed him the salt. Later that evening, I checked her closet for the hoodie she swore she lost last fall, the gray one with the college logo, the one she wore until it practically walked on its own. It wasn't there. I went back to the shed alone, flashlight in hand, my pulse thundering in my ears, and dug through the boxes until I found it, folded neatly, sealed in a plastic bag, tucked underneath the very same tarp that had once hidden the photos of a brother I was told to forget. And that was the moment something inside me broke, not with rage, but with clarity. He wasn't just preserving memories, he was collecting them, like trophies, like proof, like insurance. And now I had all the proof I needed. But the question was, what was I going to do with it? There are moments in life when silence carries more violence than a slap across the face. When the weight of knowing something, truly deeply knowing it in a way that crawls under your skin and takes up residence in the spaces between your bones, changes the way you look at every word ever spoken, every glance exchanged, every half-remembered lullaby or birthday candle or quiet car ride home. That night, after I found Leah's hoodie buried in the shed, like it was part of some grotesque time capsule, I sat at the kitchen table for over an hour without moving, without drinking the tea I had poured, or turning off the overhead light that hummed with a low electric buzz, because I knew that when morning came, I would not be the same person, and neither would anyone else under this roof. I spent the hours before dawn planning, not in the manic, impulsive way of someone seeking revenge, but with the cold, methodical precision of a woman who had been patient long enough, who had swallowed every bitter pill handed to her by time and family and obligation, and who now found herself holding not just pieces of the truth, but the power that came with deciding how much to use and when to use it. This wasn't about justice anymore, not really. This was about equilibrium, about making him feel what we had felt, uncertain, exposed, disoriented in the face of something too large and too intimate to explain. So I did what he had done so many times before. I brewed the coffee. I used the same pot, the same mug with the chipped #1 dad label, the same steady, calm movements he would have approved of, because the key to manipulation isn't drama, it's consistency. I waited until the house was awake, until the smell crept through the hallway like a memory on fire, until I heard his slow, careful footsteps make their way down the stairs. He entered the kitchen dressed in the same faded flannel he wore when Mom died, the same heavy expression that never changed, even when the seasons did, and sat down across from me without a word. I handed him the mug. He didn't hesitate, but I saw the flicker, that brief, infinitesimal pause before the first sip. So brief a stranger would have missed it, but not me. He drank, slow and steady, then set the cup down with a hand that barely trembled, either because he had learned to control the shake or because he hadn't taken his own pills in days. I said nothing for a moment, just watched, studied the lines around his eyes, the skin on his hands, the way his knuckles were starting to bruise from leaning too hard into things to stay upright. Then I spoke. I visited Eli's grave. He didn't look up, didn't ask why, didn't even pretend to care. But I saw the twitch in his jaw, the subtle shift in his posture, as if bracing for a blow he knew he deserved, but still hoped wouldn't come. "There's nothing there," I said, my voice flat, almost clinical, as if I were commenting on a weather forecast or an empty grocery shelf. No remains, no marker inside the coffin, just dirt and wood. His eyes moved then, not to me, but toward the window, to the dying lilac bush that Mom used to trim every spring. He didn't ask how I knew, didn't argue, didn't deny, which in itself was an answer. "You didn't bury him," I continued, leaning forward slightly, not out of aggression, but out of control. Because I had it now, and I needed him to feel it pressing into his ribs like a slowly tightening belt. "You hid him, and I don't know where, but I think Susan does, and I think Leah is next." That finally made him flinch. His head snapped toward me, eyes wide for the first time in years, mouth opening like he was going to speak but finding no words, because how do you defend yourself when the accusation isn't murder or abuse, but the slower, quieter erosion of someone's spirit, the theft of their autonomy one silent day at a time? "You think I'd hurt her?" he asked, voice cracking, not with grief, but with offense, like I'd insulted his character instead of pulling back the curtain on it. I nodded once. "I don't think," I said. "I know." There was something so still about the room then, something so detached from time and gravity, that I felt like we could have been anyone. Two strangers in a gas station at midnight, two ghosts reenacting the same scene over and over, until someone finally noticed the scream hiding inside the silence. He reached for the coffee again. This time his hand was less steady. The mug clinked softly against the saucer, and I watched the tremor spread up his forearm like a wave of aftershock, like the truth inside his body was finally beginning to fight its way out. "You drugged me," he said quietly. "No," I said. "You drugged yourself. I just didn't stop you." His eyes widened, just slightly, and then narrowed as he processed that, not just the words, but the implication. Because he'd taken pills that didn't belong to him for weeks now, out of desperation, out of arrogance, out of some misguided belief that no one would ever notice or care. All I had done was leave the bottle where it had always been. All I had done was stop protecting him from himself. "You always said we should just move on," I said. "That we should let things go, not talk about the past, not dwell on the damage. But that's easy to say when you're the one doing the damage." He started to speak, some low protest bubbling at the back of his throat. But before the words came, Leah walked in. She looked at him, she looked at me, then at the mug. Grandpa, she asked, the smallest crack of concern threading her voice. You okay? His hand jerked slightly as he tried to smile. Just tired. Leah looked from him to me again, then slowly walked to his side, crouching beside him like a loyal soldier, like a child still uncertain whose version of the truth she was supposed to believe. And in that moment, as she reached for his hand and he let her take it, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Not from guilt, but from clarity. This wasn't over, and maybe it never would be, because family doesn't unravel with a single discovery or confession. It pulls apart thread by thread, memory by memory, until one day you look around and realize you're standing in a house full of people you once loved, surrounded by the ruins of secrets that were too heavy to carry, but too dangerous to set down. What did you do? Leah asked me, her voice quiet but firm. I didn't answer. I just stood there watching her cradle his hand, watching him breathe through clenched teeth and trembling fingers, and felt nothing but the cold, dull ache of a justice that would never come from courts or confessions, only from the steady drip of truth, falling like water into cracks no one else could see. And for the first time, I didn't rush to explain myself. I didn't try to make it easier. I just watched them. And in the silence that followed, I finally understood what it meant to take your power back. Not with rage, not with blood, but with the quiet conviction that no matter how hard they try, some people don't get to move on until you say they can. And this time, I wasn't saying a damn thing.